He's one of the most hated men in America. Chris Watts murdered his pregnant wife and two young girls, and now he's getting married again with a woman he met while he was behind bars.
In September of 2025, a 39-year-old realtor from Ohio walked into a courthouse and filled out a legal form. It was a simple request, the kind processed by the thousands every year. She wanted to change her name. Her new last name would be Watts. Not by marriage, not yet. By choice, filed months before any wedding could legally happen. Filed for a man she cannot touch except for 10 seconds at a time. Filed for a man who will die in a Wisconsin prison cell. His name is Christopher Watts. In August of 2018, he strangled his pregnant wife in the bedroom of their Colorado home, then drove her body, along with the bodies of his two little girls, out to an oil field and pushed them into the dark. 7 years later, prison visitation logs show a woman has visited him 20 times in a single year.
Shows she visited Watts 23 times over 15 months. Each was a contact visit lasting up to 3 hours.
She's relocated her entire life, moved states, to be closer to his cell. Witnesses say they've watched them kiss. Family members say they've discussed marriage.
Relatives have told us that Lizzie and Chris are going through the motions of applying to get permission to be married behind bars. And to do that, they have to get permission from the warden and also meet a very strict kind of list of criteria first.
So this could take some time.
It could take some time.
And somewhere in Wisconsin right now, a woman is going by the name Lizzie Watts, before the law has even agreed to let her use it. So the question isn't really about him. We already know what he is. The question is about her, and about the dozens of women who wrote to him before her. What is it exactly that they're seeing? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how a convicted family annihilator builds a fan base from behind bars, and why prison officials may not be able to stop what's happening next. Before we continue, if a case like this pulls you in and you want verified updates without the rumors and fabricated information spreading across social media, subscribe to Midnight True Crime. Before we get to Lizzie Henderson, we have to go back to the beginning, because you cannot understand the horror of this new relationship without understanding exactly what Chris Watts did, in detail, without flinching. Chris Watts was, by every outward appearance, unremarkable. A soft-spoken oil field operator living in Frederick, Colorado, married to Shanann Watts since 2012. The two of them had met on Facebook, built a life, had 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. In the summer of 2018, Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy she'd already named Nico. On August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip in the early morning hours. Within hours, she, Bella, and Celeste were gone. Chris Watts reported his family missing later that day, standing in front of television cameras pleading, apparently, for their safe return. He gave interviews. He hugged neighbors. He looked to the entire country watching, like a devastated husband and father. He was lying the entire time. Under police pressure and confronted with the results of a polygraph he failed, Watts eventually confessed. He admitted to strangling Shanann in their bed after she discovered he was having an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger and was preparing to leave him. Investigators later revealed Watts had been searching days earlier for information about starting a new life, and Kessinger herself had reportedly browsed wedding dresses online in the days before the murders, believing Watts was already divorced. But strangling Shanann wasn't the end of it. Watts then loaded his daughters into his truck, girls who, according to his own confession, may have still been alive at that point, and drove out to the Anadarko petroleum oil site where he worked. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave near the tank battery. Bella and Celeste were placed inside separate oil tanks with openings barely large enough to push a small body through. He did this, and then he drove home. He went on television. He asked the public for help finding his family. For nearly a week, Chris Watts played the role of the grieving husband almost flawlessly. He sat for interviews with local news crews, his voice cracking at what appeared to be exactly the right moments. He hugged Shanann's friends. He posted online, pleading for tips. Investigators would later say that Watts even submitted to a polygraph exam early in the investigation and failed it so badly that detectives knew almost immediately they were looking at their suspect, even before they had a body. What finally broke the case open wasn't forensic evidence. It was pressure. Investigators confronted Watts directly, laid out the inconsistencies in his story, and watched him crack in real time on recorded interrogation footage that would later become some of the most viewed true crime video in the genre's history. Watts eventually admitted an affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger, and claimed, in a version of events prosecutors never fully accepted, that Shanann had killed their daughters herself after learning of the affair, and that he'd killed Shanann in a rage afterward. Investigators didn't buy it, neither did the physical evidence. He ultimately admitted to strangling Shanann himself. Watts eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. His case became one of the most consumed true crime stories in modern history, dissected in documentaries, podcasts, and, yes, channels exactly like this one. Netflix's American Murder: The Family Next Door used the family's own text messages, home videos, and police body cam footage to reconstruct the case almost in real time, and it introduced Chris Watts to an audience of millions who had never heard his name before. That exposure did something predictable, and something the public rarely likes to talk about. It made him famous. Not admired necessarily, not respected, but recognizable, instantly, globally recognizable, in a way that almost no other inmate serving a life sentence in the American prison system can claim. And recognizability, it turns out, is its own kind of currency. Here's something that will genuinely unsettle you. The interest in Chris Watts did not start with Lizzie Henderson. It started almost immediately after his sentencing. Within months of his 2018 conviction, reports emerged that Watts was receiving a steady stream of love letters in prison, dozens of them, from women across the country, some enclosing photographs of themselves. Investigators and reporters who reviewed some of these letters described women describing an emotional connection to Watts. Women saying they thought about him constantly. Women reaching out despite knowing exactly what he had done to his own family. This isn't unique to Watts. Criminologists have a name for the broader phenomenon: hybristophilia, an attraction some people feel specifically toward individuals who have committed violent crimes. But Watts represents something slightly different from the usual profile. He isn't a Ted Bundy, a case study in charisma and manipulation. By nearly every account, Watts was plain, unremarkable, almost forgettable, until the cameras turned him into one of the most recognizable faces in true crime. That's the uncomfortable engine driving all of this. Fame. Not charm. Fame. A former prison psychologist has publicly discussed developing a close relationship with Watts after corresponding with him in prison, saying she was initially drawn in by how quickly his case moved through the legal system, a 2-month plea deal in a case she felt should have taken years. That relationship became the subject of a televised true crime series. So by the time Lizzie Henderson enters the picture in 2024, she isn't the first woman to find her way to Chris Watts's cell. She's simply the one who went the furthest. If a case like this pulls you in, and I know it does, because you're still here, do us a favor and hit subscribe before we go further. We break down cases like this multiple times a week, and the algorithm only shows this channel to more people if you're part of that number. Drop a comment too. We want to know what you think is really going on with these relationships, because we're about to get into the details. According to reporting from the Daily Mail, which first broke this story, and has since been corroborated in broad strokes by outlets including Inside Edition, Lizzie Lee Henderson is a 39-year-old licensed realtor. For most of her adult life, she lived in Ohio. At some point, reportedly, she relocated to Wisconsin, the state where Chris Watts is now incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, after being transferred out of Colorado's prison system. That relocation is, on its own, one of the more staggering details in this entire story. This isn't a woman writing letters from a distance. This is a woman who picked up her life, reportedly relocating with her mother, for whom she is said to be a primary caretaker, and moved to a new state specifically to be closer to a man serving 3 consecutive life sentences for murdering his family. Currently, according to reporting, Henderson works at a local grocery store, though she maintains an active Wisconsin real estate license. When contacted directly by reporters, Henderson did confirm that she is in a relationship with Chris Watts. She didn't deny it. She didn't dodge it. She reportedly maintains regular contact with him through prison messaging systems, in addition to in-person visits, and family members say the relationship has been ongoing for at least a year and a half, if not longer, based on how far along the visitation records and correspondence stretch. That's not a fleeting infatuation sparked by a viral clip. That's a sustained, deliberate, long-running relationship, the kind that requires repeated trips to a maximum security facility, background checks to get on an approved visitor list, and a willingness to keep showing up, month after month, for a man who will never walk out those doors. What she wouldn't do is explain how it started. Asked how their relationship began, Henderson reportedly gave a brief, almost spiritual answer, that how things began between them is something known only to her, to him, and to God. It's a carefully worded non-answer. It tells you nothing about the mechanics. No explanation of whether this began through a pen pal service, a mutual connection, or something else. But it tells you everything about how she sees this relationship, not as a curiosity, not as an experiment, as something sacred to her. When asked directly how she felt about the murders, about a pregnant woman and 2 little girls, Henderson's response, according to the reporting, was that Watts knows exactly how she feels about it, without elaborating further to the reporter. In a separate comment, she reportedly described the killings as something harsh for anyone to have to experience, a strikingly detached way to describe the murder of a family. She has also acknowledged, in her own words, that outsiders might see the relationship as strange. That much, at least, she isn't hiding from. Now let's talk about what actually backs this story up, because a documentary like this one only works if we're honest about what's confirmed and what's still secondhand. Court records reviewed by reporters show that Henderson filed an application to legally change her surname on September 12, 2025. That's a matter of public record, a real, filed legal document, not a rumor. According to her family, she has already begun using the name Lizzie Watts in prison correspondence and messaging systems well before any legal marriage could exist. Photographs obtained by reporters reportedly show Henderson wearing a ring on her left ring finger, the traditional wedding band finger, despite no confirmed marriage having taken place. Prison visitation records, according to multiple reports, show Henderson visiting Watts approximately 20 times over roughly the past year, with some outlets citing as many as 23 visits across a 15-month span, each contact visit reportedly lasting up to 3 hours. She also reportedly spent Christmas Day of 2024 with him inside the facility. And then there's the eyewitness account. A fellow visitor at the prison, identified as Lisa Johnson, told reporters she personally witnessed Henderson and Watts embrace and kiss during a visit in August of 2025, notably just 1 day after the 7th anniversary of the murders. Dodge Correctional Institution does not permit conjugal visits, and physical contact during standard visitation is tightly restricted, typically limited to a brief hug at the start and end of a visit. According to Johnson's account, the two used every second of that allotted contact, embracing for the entire window permitted. Johnson has also said Henderson appeared visibly enamored during the visit, smiling, eager, and hopeful for a photograph with him, and that Watts held a Bible with him throughout the encounter. Perhaps most significantly, relatives of Henderson's have told reporters that the couple has submitted a formal written marriage request through the Wisconsin prison system. Wisconsin law does allow incarcerated individuals to apply for permission to marry, but that approval isn't automatic. It requires sign-off from prison officials, and as of this reporting, there is no public confirmation that request has been approved or that any legal marriage has taken place. So here's where we actually stand. A documented relationship, confirmed by the woman herself. A legal name change application, filed and on record. Visitation logs showing dozens of visits, an eyewitness account of physical affection, and a reported but not independently confirmed request to marry. What we do not have is confirmation from Wisconsin's Department of Corrections that any marriage request has been formally approved. Until that happens, the accurate way to describe Lizzie Henderson is as Chris Watts' girlfriend, and reportedly his prospective wife, not, at this point, his confirmed legal spouse. It's worth pausing here to underline exactly how much verification separates this story from a rumor. This isn't a tip from an anonymous forum or a screenshot circulating on social media. This is public court paperwork, prison visitation logs obtained through records requests, a named eyewitness willing to put her account on the record, and a direct, on-camera adjacent confirmation from Henderson herself. That's an unusually high bar of documentation for a story like this, which is exactly why it's been picked up by multiple national outlets within days of first breaking, rather than dismissed as tabloid speculation. What remains genuinely unverified is the internal machinery of the relationship, how it began, what Watts has actually said to her about the murders in private, and whether Wisconsin's prison system will ultimately sign off on a wedding. Those are the threads still hanging, and they're the ones worth watching if this story develops further. Not everyone in Henderson's orbit is on board, and this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because it isn't just true crime commentators questioning her judgment. It's her own family. According to reporting, some of Henderson's relatives were aware she was in a relationship with an incarcerated man, but say they didn't initially understand who he was or grasp the full weight of what he'd done. Once the truth surfaced, the reactions inside her own family split. Her sister, identified in reporting as Frederica Henderson, has been openly critical. In comments to Inside Edition, she pushed back directly on the idea that someone serving a sentence for crimes of this severity should be permitted the privilege of a relationship at all, arguing that incarceration for crimes like this should come with the loss of that privilege, not the freedom to pursue it. Meanwhile, other relatives, including, according to reports, a former stepfather, say they were already fully aware of the relationship and of the marriage discussions well before this story became public. That's a family fractured, publicly, over a decision one of their own has made about a man she will never legally be allowed to touch outside of a 10-second embrace. It raises the question we should all be sitting with. What happens to a family when one of its members falls in love with someone the rest of the world sees as a monster? There's no clean resolution here. Henderson's sister isn't wrong to be alarmed. The logic of her objection is straightforward and, frankly, hard to argue with. A man who forfeited his family's lives arguably forfeited his own right to build a new one. But it's also true that adults are legally free to write to, visit, and even marry whoever they choose, provided the other party consents and the institution allows it. The law doesn't require Henderson's choices to make sense to her sister or to any of us watching this unfold from the outside. It only requires that they be legal. And so far, nothing about this relationship appears to cross that line. Let's step back from Henderson specifically and ask the bigger question, because this case is not an outlier. It is, disturbingly, a pattern. Highly publicized killers, particularly ones who dominate true crime media, streaming documentaries, and podcast cycles, routinely attract this kind of attention. Ted Bundy received sacks of fan mail during his trial. The Menendez brothers have accumulated devoted followings online. Even lesser-known inmates convicted of horrific crimes report receiving letters once their case gets national attention. Psychologists who study this phenomenon point to a few overlapping explanations. Some point to a safety paradox, the idea that a relationship with someone permanently incarcerated is, in a strange way, a controlled and low-risk form of intimacy. There's no possibility of physical danger to the person on the outside. No risk that the man you're falling for will show up unannounced, escalate, or become violent toward you, because he legally can't. For some, that safety is the entire appeal. Others point to a desire to be the exception, the belief that this particular person is different, misunderstood, capable of change in a way the rest of the world simply hasn't seen. It's a belief that shows up again and again in interviews with women who pursue relationships with incarcerated killers. The conviction that they, uniquely, understand something everyone else has missed. And then there's simple notoriety. Chris Watts isn't an obscure inmate. He is one of the most covered true crime subjects of the last decade, the subject of a Netflix documentary watched by millions. That level of exposure functions, whether anyone likes it or not, like a strange kind of celebrity. And celebrity, even monstrous celebrity, draws attention. None of these explanations make the outcome any less disturbing. A man who annihilated his own family is, right now, in a position to receive letters, visits, physical affection, and a marriage proposal, while the family he destroyed receives none of that. Shanann Watts, Bella, and Celeste don't get visitation. They don't get a second chance at love. They got a shallow grave and an oil tank. Chris Watts isn't even an isolated case within his own prison system, or within true crime more broadly. Notorious killers who've become fixtures of streaming documentaries and viral podcast episodes routinely report an uptick in fan mail after their story resurfaces online, a strange side effect of the true crime boom itself. The genre exists, in large part, to warn people, to document victims, to hold killers accountable in the court of public memory. But every time a case like this gets millions of views, it also puts a face and a name in front of an audience that includes people looking for exactly this kind of connection. It's an uncomfortable truth about the very format all of us are consuming right now, this video included. That doesn't mean true crime coverage shouldn't happen. Cases like this deserve scrutiny, and victims deserve to be remembered accurately rather than forgotten. But it's worth naming the side effect honestly instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Here's a legal wrinkle that surprises a lot of people. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that prison inmates retain a fundamental right to marry, even while incarcerated, a right that can be restricted for legitimate security or logistical reasons, but not eliminated outright. That means prison officials generally cannot flatly deny Chris Watts the right to marry, simply because of what he did. What they can do is regulate how it happens. Approval processes, background checks on the intended spouse, restrictions on ceremony logistics, and, critically, the near-total absence of any conjugal rights once the marriage is finalized. If Chris Watts and Lizzie Henderson do marry, it would almost certainly be a marriage that exists only on paper and in 10-second embraces during supervised visits. No shared home. No physical relationship beyond what visitation rules already allow. No children. Nothing resembling a normal marriage in any functional sense. Which raises the real question underneath all of this. If a marriage like this offers no future, no physical intimacy, and no possibility of the man ever walking free, what is Lizzie Henderson actually building a life around? That's not a question this documentary can answer for her, but it's one worth sitting with. It's also worth noting that Chris Watts isn't the first high-profile family killer to pursue, or be pursued into, a prison marriage. Cases like this tend to resurface every few years, usually attached to whichever incarcerated figure is currently dominating the true crime news cycle. What makes the Watts case distinct is the sheer scale of documentation involved. A Netflix film, endless YouTube breakdowns, true crime podcasts numbering in the hundreds, and now a girlfriend who appears to have quietly built an entire relationship in the years since that documentary made him a household name. It's difficult to separate the romance from the fame that manufactured the opportunity for it in the first place. And there's a broader pattern worth flagging here for anyone who follows cases like this closely. Almost without exception, the men receiving this kind of attention are the ones whose crimes were the most heavily covered, not necessarily the most sympathetic or redeemable. Attention, not innocence, appears to be the deciding factor in who receives love letters behind bars. A detail that should make anyone uncomfortable about how true crime media functions as a system. 8 years ago, Chris Watts stood in front of cameras and begged the public to help bring his family home, knowing exactly where they were the entire time. Today, a woman has moved states, changed her name, and reportedly asked a state prison system for permission to marry him. Somewhere between those two moments is an uncomfortable truth about fame, obsession, and the strange gravitational pull that violence, filmed, streamed, and endlessly discussed, seems to exert on a small number of people who watch it. Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, Nico, who never got the chance to be born. They don't get a second act. They don't get a documentary about their next chapter. This is it. This is the only story anyone tells about them now, and it's a story that keeps getting hijacked by the man who ended it. So, I'll leave you with the same question I asked at the top. What does it say about someone that the only relationship they can find is with a man who will never leave a cage? If this case affected you the way it affected me putting it together, hit subscribe. I cover cases like this every single week, and it genuinely helps this channel grow when you do. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think Wisconsin should approve this marriage request? Or do you think inmates serving life for crimes like this should lose that right entirely? I read every comment, and I'll be pulling some of the best ones for a follow-up video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. This is Midnight True Crime.